All right, this is going to be Chapter 7, Learning Disabilities and Attention Deficit Disorder, Part 2. So let's get to that. Language disorders are going to lead to reading disorders. Deficits in phonological awareness and memory are going to be highly predictive of reading difficulties. Reading is about two things. Reading is about decoding and it's about comprehension. And if you have a hard time decoding, you're not even going to be able to get to the comprehension part. If you're good at decoding, that's part one. But if you don't have good comprehension, you can read and read and read, but you don't have no idea what you've read. So always remember, when we're talking about reading, it's two separate skills. One about the straight decoding, which has a lot to do with the phonological awareness skills and the phonemic awareness skills we've talked about, and then also the comprehension of what you've read. Morphological awareness is going to help children understand complex words. It's going to be related to vocabulary development, word reading, spelling, reading comprehension, right? If you know that ing at the end of the word, that you know how to pronounce it, you know what it looks like, and you also know that it means happening right now and that it's a chunk, you can read that ing really quickly rather than every time you come to an ing word, it's this new thing. You've got to figure out what it is because you don't understand that ing has a specific meaning, right? Children with learning disabilities and syntax. These kids are going to have speaking and writing that's shorter, so they'll have a lower MLU than age-typical peers. Their speaking and writing will be less complex. There'll be more errors, and there'll be poorer sentence comprehension as well. So we talked about reading comprehension, but kids that have auditory sentence comprehension difficulty are also going to have written sentence comprehension difficulty. Semantics for kids with LD. They're going to have word finding difficulties, trouble with just word meanings. And remember, those are two different things. So can you find the word in your lexicon? Okay, I've got that. What does it mean? Or do you not even have the word in your lexicon at all? You don't know what the word is. You don't know what it means. You kind of don't have anywhere to start even. And then we talked last time about figurative language. Children with LD are going to be more literal, less flexible with language than their peers, right? So very concrete. So if you ask a child with a learning disability, what is the definition of an apple, they're going to probably tell you what you do with it. So they'll say an apple is something you eat, right? Well, that's really not specific at all, right? That doesn't differentiate it from an ice cream cone, a cheeseburger, right? You have no idea. But yet if you ask them to tell you more, it's like, nope, an apple is something you eat. That's what it is. Whereas we had a good friend who had a daughter who was, way above her peers cognitively and from a language standpoint. She was really a gifted child. And when a friend of hers just asked, hey, what are some things you could do with an apple? When she was about 4, she said, well, you could draw a face on it and tie a little hat on top and make it a person, or you could tie a string on it and make an apple yo-yo, or you could put it around your wrist and tell people you have an Apple Watch, right? And that's a lot of language there. That's a lot of creative language, something that a child with a learning disability or a language disability simply wouldn't be able to come up with all that. Even an older child wouldn't be able to do that. These kids are going to have difficulty organizing word meanings. Multiple meaning words are really important. We talked about that with jokes before. All right, so if things mean more than one thing and you don't understand that, that's going to be really difficult. Again, is it a semantic deficit or a retrieval deficit? So a semantic deficit means I don't have the word in my lexicon, it doesn't exist. It's like I've never seen it before. Whereas a retrieval deficit, it's like, oh, it's there. I've seen that word. I know that word. I have it in my lexicon. It just takes me a long time to access what the word is and what that word means. So it's there, but it just takes a long time to access it and use it. One way we can get at this is through confrontational naming. So if we show the child pictures, what's this, what's this, what's this, right? Are they going to be able to come up with names of things, or are they going to really struggle? So, and if they're struggling, you're going to see circumlocution. So describing the item, right? If you show them a picture of a hammer and they say, oh, it's this thing, and you hit it, and you can hit a nail, or you can hit things together, and you hit, right? So I'm describing maybe what I do with it, but I can't come up with the actual word substitutions, right? So you might call a hammer a nail, you might call a hammer a bat, you might call a hammer something else. And there are going to be lots of interjections, lots of lots of uhs, lots of likes, wells, all within all that, right? And all of us have those interjections, right? These kids are just going to have more of them. All right, pragmatics for kids with LD. These kids are going to participate in fewer peer interactions, right? And the fewer peer interactions you participate in, the less practice you get with them, you're not as good at them, right? They're going to be less preferred communication partners according to their peers. They're going to be less accepted by their peers, and they're going to have real difficulty establishing friendships, right? We talked about that at the beginning. These are going to be kids who lack the ability to analyze social situations, to plan their responses, and to evaluate the consequences of their actions. They're going to have a hard time clearly expressing themselves. They're going to have a hard time adjusting their language to the needs of the listener. Right? They're not going to be able to go, oh, this person already has this background information, so I don't have to explain that. Right? They're going to act as if everybody knows them really well and just start talking about their uncle or their cousin or their sister or their brother when there's no background information. These kids also who have a really hard time knowing what to do if they don't understand something. So very often they'll nod their head, they'll act as if they understand because they don't know how to act. They don't know how to ask for clarification. They don't know how to say, hey, can you back up? I didn't understand that. Because often they sort of in that moment, they don't know what they don't know. So they're realizing that they're not getting something, but until time passes, they can't figure out what it is they don't know. So they don't know how to ask for help in the moment. These social behavioral problems are going to be linked to severity of language problems. So the more severe the language problem, the more severe the social or behavioral issues are going to be. Children with severe LD are going to be less pro-social. And that's going to include things like being sympathetic, being comforting to others, being able to share with others. So there's going to be really difficult tasks for kids with severe LD, and even kids with mild LD are going to show signs of this, right? They're not going to be able to pick up on clues that others are having a hard time. So they're going to have a hard time being sympathetic and comforting, and they're not going to want to share, like they're doing something, they have something, they want to keep that something. All right. Metalinguistic skills, playing word games, rhyming, recognizing non-grammatical sentences. These are things that are not essential for spoken language, right? You don't really have to know how to rhyme, how to, recognize, grammatical sentences versus non-grammatical sentences. you can have great spoken language skills without being able to do those things, but these are essential for being able to read and write. So improving phonemic awareness ability is going to improve reading and spelling abilities. We talked a lot about phonemic awareness abilities in the last chapter, right? Kids who have LD, when they write, they're going to have fewer words and sentences. So again, it's going to be shorter, less complicated, unorganized text, very simple, non-phonetic spelling errors, right? So if you have a child who spells house, right, and they spell it wrong, right? Maybe they spell it H-U-S, right? But all the sounds are there. That would be a phonetic spelling error. A non-phonetic spelling error would be spelling house, where you spell it maybe H-O-W, but you leave off a sound. So kids with LD are going to be more likely to have non-phonetic spelling errors. Kids who are typical, who have good language and typical learning skills, are going to have phonetic spelling errors. There are going to be a lot of repetitive words, so using the same words over and over again, because they're going to have a smaller vocabulary, a harder time accessing that vocabulary, right? They just use the same words over and over again. And often these kids are going to have poor handwriting, poor letter formation, a real difficulty with uppercase and lowercase letters, which one goes where, uneven spacing in their writing, phonetic versus non-phonetic errors. So we just talked about that, right? So school, you've got all the sounds there is a phonetic error, where a non-phonetic error, you're not going to have all the sounds there. And that's going to be our learning disabled kids. They're going to use visual memory to compensate for phonological weakness. So they're going to try to remember, they're going to try to picture that word in their head of actually how it is written out, rather than being able to sound it out. And they're also going to have morphological deficits. So he chose the jacket for its warmth, right? That's kind of a higher level morphology, right? They're going to be really late in being able to pick out a word like that. All right, now part of what complicates all this, right, is we've got different words for different things. So we've also got specific language impairment, or SLI. This is going to be a language deficit without accompanying factors such as hearing loss, intellectual impairment, neurological damage. So we can talk about, is this child learning disabled? Are they speech language impaired? Or are they specific language impaired, as SLI? Or is it a reading disorder, or all three things at once? In some ways, it's not that important, right? You've got to help them with what's the most important thing that they're having trouble with, what's the one thing that would help them the most at school and in life, and work on that. And we don't have to worry too much about what the actual label is. We have to work on helping our kids. Also complicating all this, right, is we've got attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. This is going to be a persistent pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity, impulsivity that interferes with functioning or development, right? So in order to have ADHD, you've either got to have inattention, so you can have ADHD inattentive, or you can have ADHD hyperactive impulsive, or you can have a combination of all three. About 45% of those with ADHD exhibit academic learning difficulties really similar to those who are learning disabled. And kids with one disorder will often have other disorders. Disorders often cluster together, so you can have both of them at once. ADHD is one of the most common neurobehavioral disorders. About 11% of children aged 4 to 17 are diagnosed with ADHD at some point. Between 45 to 90% of children with ADHD have a co-occurring language disorder. Again, things cluster together. Kids with ADHD are going to score significantly lower than their peers on tests of word knowledge, working memory, reading, and math. So we can get in, right? Is this a learning disability? Is this a language disability? Is this an attentional disability? Is it a mix of two, a mix of three? It gets complicated. For kids with ADHD, the big semantic difficulty is their expressive vocabulary. Their expressive vocabulary is going to be much less than their typically developing peers. They're going to use a lot fewer. They're not going to use as many vocabulary words as their typically developing peers. Right? They're also going to have a lot of pragmatic difficulties. They're going to have social interaction difficulties, conversation initiation, right? So I can't think of, I'm having trouble following the conversation. So how do I start? How do I begin what I'm going to say? How do I know what I'm going to say? They have a hard time with story retelling. They have a hard time sequencing and using pronouns, right? So these are kids who, when they retell a story, might tell the end first. They might use him, her, his before they've said who those people are. And they're going to have a hard time developing peer relationships because they'll often, again, have a hard time following conversation, being able to tell a good story. They're going to have fewer friends. Many of these kids struggle the most in the pragmatic area, right? This all is part of pragmatics 2. Being unable to use language in an appropriate manner for a variety of purposes, right? Having trouble initiating a conversation, taking turns and not just talking. If they make an error, being aware of that error, repairing the error in real time and moving forward, rather than just making errors and not even realizing it. And they have a harder time asking questions, again, because they have a harder time being focused on what's going on. So they miss something completely, so they can't ask a question about it because they don't even know what it is. Harder time with topic maintenance. Harder time with lots of meaningless starters. So well, like, and then maybe I'll say something that doesn't have anything to do with what I'm actually talking about, and then I'll finally get to what I'm talking about, right? These kids are going to have what people call survival language, so lingo associated with peer language. So they're going to try to use a lot of the words that their peers are using, even though they might not really know what those words mean. They're going to struggle with, how to be a part of a peer group through actions and communication. That's going to be really hard for them. These kids are going to be more likely to engage in inappropriate behavior, right? If I'm not able to follow along, number one, I might just go ahead and act out because I'm upset. I don't know what's going on, or I don't know what's going on, so I'm just going to do my own thing. I'm not acting out because I'm mad or angry that I can't follow along, but I'm just going to do whatever I want to do. Those are two reasons why these kids are going to be much more likely to engage in inappropriate behavior. Specific language impairment. These kids are going to have significant limitations in language functioning that can't be attributed to deficits in hearing, oral structure and function, or general intelligence. So again, all these things kind of have to be lined up. We have to try to be able to separate SLI with ADHD, and that's hard. More about SLI. Not every SLI child is going to have pragmatic struggles. SLI children are not going to be a preferred playmate, though, on average. Children with SLI prefer adults as their conversational partners, right? So these are going to be kids that are going to have typical or better cognition, typical or better speech, typical or better hearing, right? So their language isn't great, so their peers aren't going to relate to them really well. Right, but adults are going to be more likely to give them more time, to spend time with them. So they're going to that's going to be the preferred partner. These kids are going to be more withdrawn, have less time interacting with peers. right? And this all kind of snowballs on itself, right? The less you interact with your peers, the worse you get at being able to interact with peers. So then the less you want to interact with them, and it just goes on and on. These kids are going to often struggle with emotional regulation, right? And that's hard. If you don't have the words for things, that also means you don't have the words for how you're feeling. And then you're going to have a difficulty with your emotions. Working together in collaborative activities are going to be difficult for SLI kids. SLI children are going to participate less than their peers, and success may often depend on their social functioning. So if you have an SLI kid who has strong pragmatics, right, they're going to be much more successful than a child that has SLI across the board, including pragmatics. That social functioning piece is huge for a lot of these kids. Scaffolding systems are really helpful. So starting with what they are able to do and then moving up and building on what they're able to do, and use that to help them with things they can't do. High functioning peers can be models for them for their language and their activities. Literacy skills and phonological processing with specific language impairment. Even children who appear to resolve an early language disorder are going to be impacted in middle and high school. Children need to be followed for academic demands and peer relationships, right? So you can have kids who very early on struggle with reading, struggle with language. They end up getting great intervention, either from the speech language pathologist, the classroom teacher, the special education teacher, the parents, a combination of all of the above, and they're able to get into the average range with everything, and they're doing well. And then all of a sudden they get to middle school and or high school, and they have to read a chapter in a science textbook every week, and that's loaded with language, and it's really hard. And then all of a sudden all that language difficulty is going to resurface and come back, and now these kids who were able to perform in the average range if they worked really hard, now they're going to struggle even if they're working really hard. Okay. And that is the end of the chapter.